Section 6 of Music by Ursula Creighton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6, Polyphonic Music in England and on the Continent. When Dunstable died in 1453 and was buried in London, his work was famous all over Europe. Wherever his and similar music written by other Englishmen was known, it influenced musicians by giving them a new aim and a new outlook on what music could be. It must be borne in mind that this music for voices singing parts together was not quite the same as much modern choral music. Now we often hear one voice, probably the highest, sing the tune, while the other voices sing notes that sound well combined with the tune in the manner of an accompaniment. Musicians who cultivated Dunstable's style of writing did not write like that. To them, each part was equally important. Each voice had to sing a part that was a melody in itself. Music in this style of composition is called counterpoint, and the sound of all the voices singing their combined melodies is called polyphony. The melodies were not very different from each other. In fact, they often imitated each other. Gradually, musicians became so practiced in this manner of writing that they could make each voice imitate the one before in short phrases. This is called fugue. Or two or more voices would imitate each other the whole way through a piece, one voice starting after the other and singing the same tune, and this is called canon. One short canon familiar to everyone is the tune to Three Blind Mice, where three voices each sing the same tune, beginning after each other and yet combining in harmonious sound. Such a canon is also called a round or catch, and singing rounds became later a very popular amusement. Musicians now began to understand the beauty of blended sounds. Learned composers were still prominently interested in canons and fugues, but gradually, as they put new parts and new melodies together, they found new combinations, sometimes harsh enough, but sometimes affording a succession of blended sounds that was of magic beauty. So, while musicians remained interested in clever devices of academic composition, they were becoming more and more alive to the possibility of new and living beauties in sound. In Italy, in the 14th century, a cultivated society was growing up which devoted a great deal of time to music. Young people played and sang and danced, and in Florence there lived the famous blind organist, Francesco Landini, who used a little portable organ and who played so sweetly that everyone who listened felt his heart overflowing with happiness. Italy attracted all the best musicians of the day. The most famous composers were Flemish. These Flemish composers almost all passed part of their lives in Italy, in one of the celebrated choirs there, and all the best Italian choirs were conducted by them. They wrote some of the earliest secular part songs called madrigals, and they cultivated Dunstable's style of writing, adding new grace and lightness. Of all the Flemish composers, two stand out as especially famous: Josquin des Prés and Orlando di Lasso. The music of Josquin des Prés, about 1445 to 1521, still has beauty for us. For 60 years, he was considered the greatest musical genius the world had ever known, and his music for the church, which was his most important work, was sung everywhere. It was during his lifetime that music was first printed, 1498, and almost all the first published books of music contain works by him. Anne Boleyn, the wife of Henry VIII and mother of Queen Elizabeth, learned pieces by Josquin, and some of his music is to be found in a book which belonged to Henry VIII and is now at Cambridge. We are not likely to hear it often, for much of it is florid in style. That is, each voice sings a great many notes and long passages of music on a word or even a syllable, rather showing the wonderful way voices can move than adding expression to the music. But some of his combinations of sound are very beautiful, and we can appreciate them even if we do not understand the great learning that underlay his writing. He also wrote some light secular pieces for voices which still sound gay and delightful to our ears. Orlando di Lasso, died 1594, was born soon after Josquin's death, and by all accounts was a very lovable person, as well as being a composer universally famous for his music. As a boy, his voice was so beautiful that he was stolen 3 times from the choir school where he was studying music, and it was his conspicuous talent that gave him an appointment with a famous soldier, the commander of Charles V's army. With him he stayed in Sicily and Italy, and he was only a young man when he was appointed to conduct the choir at St. John Lateran, which was the most celebrated choir in Rome. He visited England in the suite of an Italian nobleman and then settled at Antwerp. Here he interested cultured people in music and gained their admiration and affection. It was while he was becoming so popular and famous in Antwerp that he was given the appointment, where he added not only to his own musical fame, but to the fame of the town to which he moved, Munich. The Duke of Bavaria, who founded the Royal Library at Munich and who was very fond of music, invited Lasso to direct the chamber music at his court, and after a few years, when the old head of the Duke's chapel retired, Orlando, having learnt the language, was made master of the chapel. An old chronicler says that he behaved so gently that everyone was forced to love him, to respect him in his presence, and praise him in his absence. The Duke attended musical mass daily, and music accompanied all banquets. First the wind instruments, then strings would play, and at dessert came the choir that Lasso conducted, and the Duke loved this music so much that he would leave the table to listen to it. He took a constant interest in Lasso's compositions, and it was he who suggested the composition of the 7 penitential psalms. He had a wonderful illuminated copy made of this famous composition, which is still one of the treasures of the Munich Library. Lasso was sent all over Europe collecting musicians for the Duke. In Paris, the special welcome he was given by the French king is mentioned by the well-known French poet Ronsard. He appears to have been a wonderful conductor of the choir, his presence being an inspiration to the singers. He wrote an enormous number of works, sacred and secular, and though the music with which he was brought up was to us largely artificial, intricate, and dry, Lasso's genius passed from such training to a beautiful simplicity and on to effects quite in advance of his day in their power of expression. The art of counterpoint, so great in the hands of Josquin des Près, just as it became perfected and fluent in the hands of Palestrina, became gracious and sweet in the works of Orlando di Lasso. Lasso lived at a time when great changes were taking place in the world. The revival of Greek learning in Italy, which we call the Renaissance, had filled men's minds with new beauties and new ideas. Columbus had just made his discovery of America, 1497. The invention of printing in 1438 was helping to spread the new learning all over Europe, and men's minds were full of those ideas about religion which were the cause of the Reformation. All this had a great effect on musicians. They sought constantly for new means of expressing the many new beauties they had to convey, and while perfecting the polyphonic style of music, they also prepared the way for writing harmonic music, such as we write today. The most famous Italian composer at this time was Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina, 1525 to 1594. He wrote perfect polyphonic music for the church, and we still enjoy its dignity, its purity, and its smooth flowing sound. His name, Palestrina, comes from a town in the Campagna, near Rome, where he was born. He spent almost all his life in Rome, first as a choir boy and then as director of different celebrated choirs in that city. He died in 1594 when he was 68 years old, leaving an immense amount of music for the church, numbers of masses for different numbers of voices, nearly 200 motets, as well as music for the other parts of the church services. One of the best known of his works is the setting of the improperia, or reproaches, which are a part of the service for Good Friday. This music is still considered some of the most beautiful he wrote, and it is still sung every year in the Sistine Chapel in Rome. We can understand something of the devotion he felt for the church, to whose service his life was dedicated, when we hear how, when he had completed his book of motets, on words taken from the Song of Solomon, he carried the book himself to the Gregory, who was then Pope, and laid it at the foot of his chair. One of his most proud and happy moments must have been in 1575, when 1,500 singers from his native town came to Rome and entered the city singing his music while he conducted them walking at their head. Spain, too, produced many excellent musicians at this time. The best known now is Vittoria, who received his musical education in Rome but died in Madrid early in the 17th century. He wrote much beautiful sacred music with great depth of feeling. The Requiem he composed on the death of the Empress Maria in 1605 is considered his most moving and beautiful work. A great deal of music was published in Venice all through the 16th century. The Flemish composers who settled in Venice and Rome wrote much secular as well as sacred music. Many different titles were given to their settings of secular words for voices singing in parts, but the name by which such compositions are now generally known is madrigals. Adrian Willaert died 1562, who was appointed by the Doge to St. Mark's in Venice, wrote some madrigals. So did Arkadelt, born about 1514, another famous Fleming who settled in Rome. And even better known as a writer of this form of composition was Verdelot, died before 1567. Returning to England, where singing was so popular, we find that throughout the 16th century, Italian madrigals were well known and often sung. One of the singers of St. Paul's Cathedral, Nicholas Jonge, had regular song parties at his house in Cornhill and had music sent every year from Italy for his friends to enjoy. The general standard of musical attainment in England was high. Every educated Englishman was expected to be able to read music at sight and take part in madrigal singing. The English love of singing and the power of English composers to write lovely music for combined voices, which had been famous for hundreds of years, was never more clearly shown than in Tudor times. Beautiful as were the madrigals written by Italian and Flemish composers, they were quite surpassed some years later by English composers. The Elizabethan age, as it is called, is known as a time when much of the most beautiful English poetry was written. It was also an age when not only beautiful literature, but perfect music was produced. The earlier English composers of Tudor times, such as Fairfax, Taverner, Tallis, and Tye, wrote mostly sacred music, but a few years later saw the publication of numbers of madrigals, which are now considered the most perfect examples of this form of composition. 25 of the best-known composers combined to write madrigals in praise of Queen Elizabeth, and each wrote one madrigal in a collection called The Triumphs of Oriana, published in 1601. One of the composers is known to us, for he was the father of John Milton the poet. One was the most musically gifted of them all, John Wilbye. Other well-known names are those of Thomas Wilkes, Thomas Morley, and Orlando Gibbons. John Wilbye, 1574 to 1638, passed most of his life in Norfolk. He was born in that county, and for many years he lived with the family of Sir Thomas Kitson at Hengrave Hall, a house near Bury St. Edmunds, which can still be seen. There he took charge of the instruments and music belonging to the family, and there he wrote some of his beautiful madrigals. The last few years of his life he passed in another house, which can still be seen in Colchester. Here lived Sir Thomas Kitston's daughter, Lady Rivers, who had always been Wilby's patron. So his life of music was all lived in connection with one family. He published 2 sets of madrigals. Now that there is a revival of interest in the lovely music of this period, Wilby's madrigals have a special position. Some of them are acknowledged to be the most perfect madrigals ever written. They have a dignity, a depth of feeling, and personal appeal that only he could produce. He had a great sense of beauty, which is still vivid in these lovely compositions. Thomas Weelkes, died 1623, published, when he was only 22 years old, a set of madrigals full of imaginative and original music, and further sets when he was organist at Winchester College. He was one of the greatest musicians of his time. Thomas Morley, 1558 to 1603, a very learned musician who excelled in light-hearted music, was organist at St. Paul's Cathedral. He published several books of madrigals or songs for several voices, some called by the name of ballets and canzonets. He also wrote a charming book on how to learn music, called The Plain and Easy Introduction to Practicale Musique, and a book of lessons for instruments playing together. Orlando Gibbons, 1583 to 1625, published only one set of madrigals, and his most famous music was written for the church. It has a dignity and style peculiar to himself, and he was one of the outstanding composers of his day. English composers, so specially famous at this time for their lovely madrigals, wrote also much music for instruments and much sacred music. For many years no other country produced music at all comparable to these beautiful works. It was in England a golden age of music. But among the many names of famous composers, one stands out above them all: William Byrd. William Byrd, 1543 to 1623, has been called the father of English music. Like most of the English composers of his time, he was a member of the Chapel Royal. He had been brought up a Roman Catholic and wrote his most beautiful music for the service of the Mass. But during his lifetime the Reformation was in progress, and when the law was passed compelling everyone to attend the new church service under penalty of a fine, Byrd and his wife were constantly summoned for refusing to obey the law. He lived usually outside London until he settled in Essex, at Stondon, where he was buried at the end of his long and active life. Musicians in those days were often attached to a nobleman's house, and Byrd had private rooms with his own furniture at Lord Worcester's house in the Strand. London must have been an interesting place when Byrd was there, for it was just the time when Spenser was publishing his poem, The Faerie Queen, and when Shakespeare was making his fame by his plays. Some of the music written at that time seems rather severe and dry to us, but the best of Byrd's music is remarkable for the feeling it conveys. It seems to us as if he did not only want to write music that sounded well, but music that expressed the feeling of the words he chose. It is that makes his music still beautiful to us. His five-part Mass, which is one of his best-known works, and which can still often be heard, conveys to us feelings of deep devotion and great tenderness. Byrd and other contemporary composers did not only write music in counterpoint, but sometimes instead of writing flowing melodies in every part, they wrote the air for one voice and used the other voices to make blocks of sound to accompany the melody. These blocks of sound are what we should call chords. Such sounds used in blocks or chords made a new effect very different from the smooth flowing counterpoint which composers had hitherto written. The new style was also bound up with the beginnings of that feeling for key, which is what makes our music sound so different from the music of earlier times. In Byrd's day, composers were only just beginning to appreciate key, with the result that some of their music sounds to us a little vague and unfinished until we become accustomed to it. Modern musicians still write contrapuntal music with its interwoven melodies, and they still write music for voices, but the voice has never been better understood than it was by those composers of perfect polyphonic music in the 16th century. They produced music so beautiful that we can still enjoy it, and in its own style it has never been surpassed. The Masses of Palestrina, Lasso, Vittoria, Bird, and other contemporary composers are still sung, and so are madrigals by many English, Flemish, and Italian composers, and the beauty of such music is unfading. As we listen to it, we hear no regular time such as we hear in modern music when we count 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3, 4. In polyphonic music of this period, such regular beats and rhythms do not exist. The rhythms are constantly changing, making a wonderfully smooth flowing effect, and as the voices move melodiously along and the notes melt into each other in a beautiful texture of sound, we feel the devotion and piety, the pathos and tenderness, the childlike joy and gladness the composers expressed with such art and with such charm. All the older polyphonic musicians wrote masses, and in those days it was a common thing for the choir of every cathedral and great church in every country to collect manuscript copies of all the new and worthy music it could. It was in this way that Dunstable's music and that of his contemporaries had traveled during their lifetime to Italy and France, and it is from those countries that such music returned to us. A great deal of this music is now being discovered and published, but much of it has disappeared. During the Puritan rule in England, enormous quantities of manuscript music were lost. The cathedral libraries, which were storehouses of music written in Tudor times, one of the most musical periods of history, were ruthlessly destroyed together with the organs, glass windows, and other works of art hated by the reformers. The manuscripts were burnt, sold as rubbish, and even shipped abroad, and comparatively little remains of the wealth that then existed. End of section 6 of Music by Ursula Creighton, read by Martha Weller, Champaign, Illinois, February 22, 2024.